How is it possible for two global powers to look at the exact same events and come away with completely opposite conclusions? How does a move one side sees as purely defensive become an act of aggression to the other? That's the puzzle we're going to unpack today. We're going to explore the war in Ukraine through the lens of political realism to see how this incredible clash of worldviews could set the stage for such a devastating conflict.
And it really all boils down to this one central disagreement over a single, decades-long event, the expansion of NATO. So, from the Western point of view, this was a totally benign act. It was about offering protection to new, fledgling democracies that wanted to join. But from Russia's perspective, this was a hostile military alliance, its old Cold War enemy, marching its forces right up to its border. Just two completely irreconcilable ways of seeing the exact same thing.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, the source material we're digging into here, drawing a lot from realist scholars like John Mearsheimer, argues it's because the West and Russia were basically operating with two completely different rule books. They were viewing the world through two totally competing lenses, what we'll call liberal hegemony and political realism.
Okay, so first up, let's look at the worldview that dominated the West after the Soviet Union fell apart, liberal hegemony. This is basically the idea that the big ideological fights were over, the future belonged to liberalism. And the US, as the last superpower standing, felt it had a duty and the power to remake the world in its own image, creating this global order of peaceful, liberal democracies. And then, on the complete other side of the coin, you've got political realism. Now, this theory argues that, look, ideals are nice, but international politics is and always will be a competitive struggle for power and security between big countries. It's not about good intentions, it's about survival, national interest, and making sure nobody gets powerful enough to threaten you. So back in the 90s and the early 2000s, Western policy was running entirely on the fuel of that first worldview. The thinking in Washington, in Brussels, was that this old-school power politics stuff, realpolitik, was a relic of the past. The era of great power competition, yeah, that was over. Or so they thought.
And you can really see how these assumptions shaped everything the West did. The US saw itself as a benign hegemon, like a friendly giant. So from that point of view, its actions, like expanding NATO, couldn't possibly be seen as threatening. The liberal perspective was that Russia had absolutely nothing to fear because the West's intentions were purely noble and defensive.
And this quote from former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a key architect of this policy, wow, it just perfectly captures that mindset. According to the source, it shows this blend of liberal ideals with this powerful sense of national exceptionalism, the idea that America is just uniquely positioned to guide the world, and that because of that, its actions are inherently just.
But here's the thing. While the West was operating in this liberal bubble, Russia was looking at the exact same moves through a completely different, much older, much colder lens, the stark logic of realism.
So here's the absolute key to the realist way of thinking. Intentions don't matter nearly as much as capabilities. When a great power sees a rival military alliance, especially one that was its main enemy for decades, marching up to its front door, realist theory says it doesn't hear all the talk about benign intent. It sees a threat, an existential one.
The source uses this analogy, and it really makes the logic crystal clear. I mean, just imagine it. Put yourself in that position. Could you imagine the reaction in Washington if China or Russia decided to form a military alliance with Mexico or Canada? The U.S. response would be swift and it would be severe. Realists argue this is just how great powers act when their core security is on the line.
This really forces us to ask that central question from the realist point of view, right? Is a threat defined by what another country says it will do or by what it could do with its military? For a realist, it's not even a debate. The answer is always the latter.
And this is where it all comes to a head. Ukraine became the tragic focal point where these two worldviews didn't just disagree, they smashed into each other head-on, with absolutely devastating consequences.
Here it is, the absolute heart of the tragedy. On one hand, you have the liberal argument, which is powerful. Ukraine is a sovereign country. It has the right to choose its own future, its own allies, period. But the realist argument is just as stark and much colder. In the rough and tumble world of great power politics, the security interests of a giant will almost always crush the rights of a smaller neighbor. Great powers just don't let other great powers park their armies on their doorstep. And so, according to this analysis, it was this complete and total failure to see the world from the other's perspective, this mismatch of realities that put everyone on a collision course. The West kept pushing, believing in its rights and its noble intentions, while Russia kept pushing back, believing its very survival was on the line. And that led us right here.
Okay, so if realism offers a reason for how we got into this mess, what does it say about getting out? Well, the conclusion is pretty grim, and the path forward it lays out is, let's just say, a long shot.
So, in this hardcore realist view, any negotiated deal would have to satisfy Russia's core demands. Number one, a permanently neutral Ukraine. No NATO, no Western security deals. Number two, a Ukraine that's disarmed to the point that it can't pose a major offensive threat. And number three, an acceptance of the new territorial reality on the ground.
But the analysis immediately points out why this is probably a fantasy. For one, Ukrainian leaders would understandably never accept these terms. It would be a total surrender of their sovereignty. And many in the West want to see Russia defeated anyway. So the grim conclusion from this perspective is that this war probably isn't going to be settled at a table. It's going to be settled on the battlefield.
And this quote really sums up the entire thesis. The argument is that this post-Cold War dream of a world run on liberal rules was just that, a dream, a temporary fantasy. And when push comes to shove, the powerful forces of nationalism and raw security interests, realism, will, in this view, always win.
And that leaves us with this final, critical question for the future. That unipolar moment is clearly over. We are back in an era of great power competition. So will our leaders keep trying to operate based on the liberal ideals of the past? Or will they adopt the cold, hard, power-focused calculus of realism? The lens they choose to look through is going to shape the rest of our century.